We're going to look at Matthew 21. I think we're going to read verses 1 to 17. I was thinking it's been quite a while since we've actually had, obviously we've done things Palm Sunday, but because since I've been doing the who's preaching on what, I've forgotten every year that it's Palm Sunday. So we haven't had anything actually preached on Palm Sunday, about Palm Sunday, for a few years now. So this is a change from the routine that we sort of got ourselves into because of my forgetfulness, which is not unusual. So we're going to read Matthew 21. I'll move that back. Matthew 21, 1 to 17. Now, when they drew near to Jerusalem and came to Bethphage, to the Mount of Olives, then Jesus sent disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village in front of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, you shall say, 'The Lord needs them,' and he will send them at once." This took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, saying, "Say to the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden." The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put on them their cloaks, and they sat him on, and he sat on them. Most of the crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. And the crowds that went before him and that followed him were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest." And when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up, saying, "Who is this?" And the crowd said, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee." And Jesus entered the temple and drove out all those who sold and bought in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. He said to them, "It is written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer,' but you have made it a den of robbers." And the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying out in the temple, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they were indignant. And they said to him, "Do you hear what these are saying?" And Jesus said to them, "Yes. Have you never read, 'Out of the mouth of infants and nursing babes, you have prepared praise'?" And leaving them, he went out of the city to Bethany and lodged there. So this is the beginning of what we know traditionally as Holy Week, where we're looking forward to Good Friday and of course Easter, when Jesus rose again. And for us as Christians, I think someone actually prayed this. This is always in our consciousness, that Jesus' death, his resurrection, it's part of our life, but it's good to have a time of the year when we're reminded, when we go through the story again and we think through what he did. And the church, right from its inception, has celebrated Easter and thought through what Jesus has done. In fact, Easter Day was the day when they had baptisms in the early church. And they would save all the baptisms up, and you'd have a great big time of baptizing people. So Easter is important. And it's important also to remember that our faith is rooted in history. Ours is not a faith that's just based on some fairy tale. It's based on a real person who lived in a real time, in a real place. We know it not just from what the scriptures say. We can tell the same from non-Christian writers who lived at the time of Jesus, who tell us that Jesus was there. They didn't particularly like the Christians, but that it's a historical truth that it really, these days, there are very few that try to nullify the idea that Jesus died on a cross in Jerusalem. It's a historical fact, and that's what we stand on as the people of God. So as we're celebrating this Holy Week, and as we're thinking today of Palm Sunday, we are celebrating that it's something that is rooted and grounded in not just in scripture, but in history. Jesus really came, and it can be proved better than most things can be in history. Now, the journey to Jerusalem have been a long one. And if you look at Luke's account, in Luke 9:51, he tells us that when the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to Jerusalem. And that's really early in Luke's accounts. And all the rest of the chapters that follows and all the things that are done actually happen while Jesus and his disciples are heading towards Jerusalem. And it's only as been thinking about this, I realized that this was a significant thing. They were coming from Capernaum, which was about 90 miles up in the north, and gradually moving down towards Jerusalem over a period of time. And many things happened during that time. If you look at Luke, you will see. And during that time, Jesus sent 72 of his disciples out to tell people that he was on his way. So you can imagine, as they were coming down, there were people who were hearing the gospel, hearing about Jesus. There were people that were coming down to Jerusalem anyway. So by the time he got to Jerusalem, it wasn't just the 12. I think sometimes we can think there was just the 12. There was a whole vast amount of people who had been healed, who had found forgiveness in Jesus, who had heard him, and they were all following with him down to Jerusalem. Now, Passover was and is the most important event in the Jewish calendar. And if you remember a few weeks ago, we were talking about the actual Passover and how God delivered his people out of slavery in Egypt, and how through this deliverance, God had taken a ragtag mob of ex-slaves and was starting to make them into a nation. And so the Jewish people, when they arrived, hang on, I'm losing my notes here. So this was a really important time in the Jewish life to celebrate this this exodus that God had wrought from them. And people would have sorry, I've just lost myself in my notes. So people would have arrived in Jerusalem from all over the land to come to this festival where they would remember this great happening. And not just from Israel, but people from other nations would come. If you look at Acts 10, verse 9 to 17, 9 to 10, after Pentecost, although it was about Pentecost, Luke gives a whole list of countries that people came for that festival. And it would have been the same for them. People from all over the Mediterranean area would have flocked there. And it's reckoned about that time there would be about 2 million people on this week would have flooded to Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem, I think at that time wasn't very big. It would have been absolutely heaving. And all the villages and the towns around would have been filled with these pilgrims come to worship God on that day. And they came with an expectation. There was a longing in the hearts of the people of God that God would come and do what he did again, what he did in Egypt again for them now. There was a feeling that although God had brought them back from exile in Babylon, that still the exile hadn't finished because they were still being ruled by Gentiles. The Romans still had control and they desired that they should be free. So there was an expectation in the air that God would do something in Passover. There was an expectation that Messiah would come and that he would usher in a time of peace and a time of prosperity where the Romans are defeated and where they would be a free people again. So you can imagine what it must have been like there with all of this going on and how it would have worried the Romans a little bit. I'm sure that they increased the number of soldiers. Pilate didn't normally live in Jerusalem, but during this week he was there just in case trouble broke out. And amongst the Jews, there was always trouble brewing. And there's a number of times through Jewish history where someone rose up and said they were a Messiah and Rome crushed them. So this is the background to which Jesus is coming to. I know I always make excuses, but this week has been quite difficult. And I ended up this morning at 4 o'clock getting up and writing something down, and I hadn't had time to edit it. So I'm trying to work through and not forgetting where I got to. So, yeah. Anyhow, right, let me try to find out where I was. Now, before this, Jesus has tried to keep the lid on everything. There's what the Bible scholars often call the messianic secrets. I don't know if you've heard that term before, but whenever Jesus healed someone, he said, don't tell anyone about it. And when we come to Matthew 20, there's just before this, there's an incident where he's going through Jericho and two blind men are shouting out, Lord, have mercy on us, son of David, and they want to be healed. And it actually echoes back to another incident in Matthew, with Matthew 9, where you have the same idea that there's two, only they're in a home this time, and there's two blind men saying, Lord, son of David, have mercy on us. And at that time, he told them to keep quiet, although they didn't. They went off and blurted it all over the place. But this time, Jesus accepts this. He has come to a place in his ministry where there is no longer needs to be a lid kept on the fact of who he is. And when these blind men shout out, Lord, have mercy on me, son of David, he accepts what they're saying. And this is the start as they're just coming in. So he's now in a place where it's being revealed who Jesus is, and he's accepting that. And notice how deliberate Jesus is in what happens next. We can assume that Jesus usually walked everywhere, although there's no record to say he made any other way of getting around. And he'd already walked about 88 miles, I don't know how, over a period of time from Capernaum. But now he decides the last 2 miles into Jerusalem, he would ride on the back of a young donkey. And we're told in the passage we read how he sent 2 disciples to Bethphage, which is a small village quite near to Bethany, just outside of Jerusalem, to fetch a donkey and her colt. Now, other accounts just say it's a colt. Matthew tells us that the mother came as well. And so they say different things, but I expect he saw the point of saying that the mum came with the colt. And he gives them instructions on where to find them and what to say if anyone tries to stop them from taking them. And the question's often been asked is, did Jesus prearrange this, or did he supernaturally know that things would be like this? And it's been a point of debate throughout the centuries. There's no reason why Jesus couldn't have prearranged this. He spent a lot of time in Bethany, the village close by. No doubt his disciples were known around in that area. And it's quite possible that he did. But I like to think that that the person who owned them was told by God that he needed to put them outside. And I wonder how many times he did it before Jesus actually came along and his disciples took them. And it just says to me how sometimes we need to be sensitive when God tells us to do things that look silly. It might be that the Messiah is passing by in some way or other. But they go and they find things just as they are, and they put Jesus on the donkey. So we can't be certain how it was arranged, but one thing we can be sure of, and that's that there was a great prophetic significance to what Jesus did on riding on this colt. Actually, he didn't ride on a full-grown donkey. It was just a colt who walked alongside his or her mother. And Matthew tells us that Jesus rode on the colt to fulfill what the prophet had said. Say to the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden. And this is a combination of two prophecies. And Matthew's quite good at doing this. He's taken a part from Isaiah 62, verse 11, which we won't look at. And the second part comes from Zechariah 9, verse 9. So Jesus now is really up in the ante, so to speak. He's showing to everyone that he was there to fulfill this prophecy. Their king had come. The disciples and the others in the crowd who were making their way to the festival recognized the significance of what Jesus was doing. And they spread their cloaks on the ground, and they cut down branches of trees and they laid them before him. And they cried out, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. And can you imagine the noise and the excitement? Many of them had traveled with Jesus all that way. They had seen him heal the sick. They had seen him make the blind see. They had seen him, the lame walk. They heard his teaching. They knew what type of man he was, and many had long suspected that he was the Messiah, and some already knew. His disciples, he had already made it known to them that he was the Messiah, but now there was no mistake. Jesus was making the secret public. He is the king, and they have been waiting for. God had heard their cry for salvation, and just like he did with their forefathers, like they did with their forefathers when they cried out to him for deliverance when they were in Egypt. Now a deliverer has come, a new Moses, the anointed one. The word Hosanna means save now, and is a contraction of a Hebrew word found in Psalm 118, verse 25. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord is the next part of that psalm. And this is one of the psalms, the praise psalms that was sung as the people came towards the temple. This would have been a noisy crowd, because it wouldn't have just been Jesus. There'd have been lots of other people, and they would be singing psalms and praising God. And this particular word, Hosanna, comes from that psalm. And blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. I was going to get us to read out 118. It's a long psalm, not as long as 119, but it's quite a long psalm. So Jesus didn't try to sneak in unnoticed. This was no quiet arrival. I think there was a time when Jesus did come to Jerusalem without anyone knowing, but this time it was all out in the front. And when we need to realize when people shouted out, save now, which is what Hosanna means, as is true so often in the Old Testament, they didn't mean salvation from sin. They were expecting their warrior gods to liberate their land. And this is what it was a cry for, that God should come and deliver. But was he going to be that type of Messiah they expected? They were expecting someone who would take on their enemies and use the sword to set them free, but instead he comes humbly and in peace. Those who come to wage war arrive on horses. Those horses are the beasts you use in battle, but here comes Jesus on a donkey. Not only a donkey, a young one, a colt. Can you imagine someone riding into battle like that? A man charging into the heat of a battle on a donkey? It would be quite a comical thing to see. It would also be almost suicidal. It would be more than likely mean defeat and death. This is not what you would expect of a conquering king. But there again, it was prophesied for him to arrive like this. So I think it would have created some dissonance in the minds of those who were both praising God that their salvation was come, and this man riding on a donkey, and how does it all work? And Jesus is often difficult for people to accept because he isn't what we expect. He doesn't do what we expect him to do. Surely if he's God, he would arrive in glory and majesty. He would demand a palace and would have servants waiting on him. But instead he comes humbly, a common tradesman with little means and no servants to meet his needs. He comes to serve rather than being served. In fact, the battle he is riding to will lead to his death. The cruelest of all deaths, death on a cross. So in some ways, this figure of a man riding into battle on a donkey has some significance, but not the significance maybe they have thought. Just think about it. The crowds didn't realize what was going to happen. Although Jesus had told some of his disciples fairly shortly before this that he would face death in Jerusalem, they didn't understand him, or perhaps they just couldn't bring themselves to believe that he would die. Certainly not in the way that he was hinting he would die. Those who cried Hosanna didn't realize that the battle Jesus would go into was a battle to defeat an even greater enemy than the Romans, a battle to defeat the powers of darkness, a battle to free them from their sins. Their cry was right, but their understanding of what Jesus had come to do was wrong. Although the crowds didn't know or understand, Jesus did. He knew exactly what awaited him in the coming days, and yet he bravely rode humbly on a donkey, surrounded by the adoration of the crowd. They made such a noise and were so extravagant in their praise that, according to Luke, it riled the Pharisees who were in the crowd. They told Jesus to rebuke his disciples, but Jesus, accepting the joy and the admiration of the crowd, said to the Pharisees, I tell you, if these were silent, the very stones would cry out. This is such a change from the Jesus that we had seen before, that one who wanted to keep all things quiet. Now he was accepting the praise of the people as he enters into Jerusalem. And we see already that there's a division of those who want him and those who would rather see the back of him. And Matthew tells us that as they entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up, saying, who is this? And the crowd said, this is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee. And I'm sure the people of Jerusalem had heard of Jesus, and some may have seen in his miracles and heard him teach, because Jesus had been to Jerusalem on a number of occasions. But then there would have been many who had come from different lands, like I said before, never heard of Jesus. Also, some of the more sophisticated city people may have easily dismissed this crowd as country bumpkins who would follow anyone. But whatever their reaction, they could not ignore the great celebration that was taking place before them. There are some differences in the other gospel about what happens next. Mark, for instance, tells us that Jesus entered the temple, but because it was late, he and the 12 went out to Bethany to spend the night and came back the next morning to cleanse the temple. But all the gospel writers want to emphasize some different things, and it's possible, although it's possible to harmonize all their accounts, I won't do it here, but you can. But Matthew has a reason for skipping some of that detail and has Jesus entering the temple and turning over the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. This all took place in the court of the Gentiles. There were different courts in the temple. There was only one court that the Gentiles were allowed to enter in. These would be people who believed in God and they wanted to worship God, but because they hadn't gone through the full rites of becoming a Jew, they could not enter in further than this place. So this was the only place that Jewish believers could come. And the money changers and the animal sellers had a good thing going, or at least good for them. A lot of them who came to the temple would have had to have traveled many miles, some from overseas, and it wouldn't have been practical for them to have brought their own animals to sacrifice. So instead, they would bring a bag of money to purchase the animals when they got there. And this would make sense and wouldn't have necessarily been wrong for people to have provided this service. However, the traders have worked out a good way to make money. So they made it so that worshippers had to first change their money into temple money. This gave the money changers the opportunity to charge a high commission. Then those selling the animals could inflate their prices because they had a captive audience. There was nowhere else for them to go and get it but there. And this exploitation of the people angered Jesus. People had come to worship God, and these traders saw it as a way of making an unreasonably high profit. Rather than making it easier for people to worship, they were putting obstacles in their way. Notice that Matthew tells us in verse 12 that he overturned the seats of those who sold pigeons. Now, pigeons were the sacrifice of the poorest people. If you couldn't afford a lamb or a bigger animal, you bought a pigeon. So they were trying to exploit the poorest in their dealings as much as they were anyone else. And it seems to me that Jesus was pretty fed up with them for doing this. And I think we need to be careful that we don't put up artificial barriers in front of people that will stop them from coming to know God. I'm glad that as a church, and we decided this a long time ago, that we don't have an offering that we pass around. I always said I would never talk on this subject, so I don't know why I ended up talking on this subject, but because there's nothing wrong with giving money, and that's part of our faith is to give. And it's good to give to God, but our giving should be according with our needs. And wouldn't it be terrible if people didn't come to church simply because they had no money? That they would be embarrassed if they came and the basket came round and they had nothing to put in it. And that for me, I think it would be terrible. I know there have been times in other churches when I have felt that way. And I know I've been times in churches where I've put money in because I don't want to look too bad. And maybe some of us have done that in the past as well. God wants us to give to him according to his means, but he understands that there are times when our financial situation means we can't give in the way we would like to. Then he would rather have our love and worship than have us excluded. Also, think of those who come to church who don't believe. Maybe I've been cynical in the past, especially before I knew Jesus, and I would go to something Christian And then the basket would pass around, and then I think, oh, that's what they wanted me here. Well, perhaps that's just my heart that was really bad. But I don't want people to ever feel that about us as a church. I want people who come here to know that we're not after their money. Now, we do have a box at the back where people can give, and I would encourage us to do so, or wherever we give. But we should not feel it's under compulsion. The people in the temple were making barriers to worshipping God, and there may well have been people who were too poor who couldn't afford the pigeon even because they were inflating the prices. And so we need to make things easy. So Jesus drives them out in a prophetic act while quoting Isaiah and Jeremiah. It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, that you have made it a den of robbers. That's not exactly the way to win friends and influence people. It's not the first time he's done it, because John tells us right at the beginning of his mission, he did similar, only that time he made a whip of ropes and drove out the animals as well. So it's not the first time. And then after this, Jesus heals the blind and the lame. These were the people who the religious leaders looked down on. They thought that illness and blindness and lameness was due to God's curse. Either the person who was lame, blind, or ill has sinned, or their parents had. And we see that at a time when Jesus heals a blind man, and the disciples ask him who sinned, him or his parents. As always, Jesus goes to the rejected and makes them whole. This leads to the children crying out in the temple of all places. Hosanna to the Son of David. They are praising him in the temple. And the chief priests and the scribes are really indignant about this. How dare the children say this about Jesus? You see, the blind saw who he was. Those who were lame knew who he was, and the children knew too. But the scribes and the priests, the ones who were well off and learned, those who should have known the scriptures, couldn't see. They couldn't see who he was. And there's nothing wrong with learning. I'm glad that the Worldwide Church has scholars who know more than I do. I'm glad about it. I'm glad there are people who know the original languages of the scriptures and can translate them so that I can read them. I read people who are scholars, and I gain from them, and I know the benefit from them. But I also know how little I know after I read them usually. But great learning doesn't mean that we know God better. It's often the simple, the uneducated, the ones that society considers the least, who hear the gospel and understand. And that's where I run out of time. But I think this morning we just celebrate what Jesus has done for us. His arrival at Jerusalem means that the beginning is near, because although he dies, he rises again. And for that, I think we're all eternally grateful. Yes.